ir a la deriva, perderse.
But even if you're reading a science paper or a work of philosophy, you have to give yourself up to the thought of the other.
El escritor lo es siempre de la literatura que falta.
Entonces ahora vamos atrás. ¿Me quieren hacer alguna pregunta?
Tenéis un minuto para dibujar.
A mí me encanta que los libros empiecen justo desde la portada.
But what is the function of a novelist? I mean, maybe you can tell me.
No, I have no idea.
Hay una cuestión geográfica en la circulación de la literatura, una cuestión de mapas y fronteras.
Un monólogo interior no es sencillo de hacer una película.
It has to do with the feeling that it's truthful enough to my own experience.
So clearly, it can be taught.
Hola a todas y a todos, bienvenidos una vez más a una nueva conversación de este Filba Internacional, esta vez con una autora que admiramos muchísimo y que hace tiempo queremos que participe de nuestro festival. Me estoy refiriendo a Lydia Davis, autora norteamericana, nacida más precisamente en Massachusetts y considerada una de las autoras más importantes en la actualidad de lengua inglesa. Ella es novelista, es cuentista, ensayista, es una gran cultora del género breve, un género breve que se caracteriza por orbitar siempre entre lo cotidiano, la ficción, y son narraciones que no tienen remate final, y eso tal vez la vuelva una de las características más interesantes de su escritura. Eterna Cadencia hace unos años publicó un primer volumen de estos relatos breves, No puedo ni quiero, que está traducido por Inés Garland, y hace menos tiempo un primer volumen de ensayos, traducido por Betina González Capria, donde transita las lecturas que para ella fueron fundamentales y también piensa mucho alrededor de la escritura. Cultivó distintos premios a lo largo de su vida. El Man Booker tal vez es uno de los más importantes que recibió en el 2013. Ella va a estar conversando con otra autora que también admiramos un montón, argentina. Me estoy refiriendo a Betina González. Betina González también es novelista fundamentalmente, si bien tiene un libro de cuentos publicado por Editorial Tusquets. Hace muy poquito acaba de salir Olimpia, que es su última novela, por Tusquets también. Y también hace muy poquito salió un libro de ensayos publicado por Gog y Magog, donde también se hace referencia al oficio de escribir. Así que creemos que estas dos autoras van a tener mucho en común para conversar. Esta actividad es coproducida por la Cátedra Abierta en homenaje a Roberto Bolaño de la UDP, y también agradecemos especialmente a la Embajada de Estados Unidos y a la editorial Eterna Cadencia por acompañarnos en esta actividad. Recuerden que la edición de este Filba es híbrida, con lo cual hay un montón de actividades digitales, pero también hay un fin de semana que nos espera con presencialidad. Hoy es viernes, las actividades presenciales van a ser mañana y pasado. Revisen el programa, hay distintas sedes, la principal va a ser en el Museo Sívori para volver a encontrarnos con la literatura cara a cara y bajo el sol, si es que el tiempo acompaña. Ustedes saben también que todas las actividades del festival son libres y gratuitas, así que quien quiera colaborar con el valor de una entrada simbólica que cada uno puede poner, el link de acá abajo se los va a permitir hacer. Así que muchísimas gracias, los dejo con las mejores de las compañías, con Lydia Davis y con Betina González. Gracias.
Well, thank you, Lydia, for agreeing to this interview. I don't know if you know this, but you have a lot of fans in Argentina.
Oh.
So I'm sure they will be very pleased to listen to this interview. And speaking of Argentina, I know that you lived in Buenos Aires for a short period of time, many years ago. What do you remember from that time? What is that? The thing you remember the most from the city?
Well, I lived there I went down right after my high school year finished, and that was in June. My parents were already living there, and my father was teaching at La Plata. And we lived there, we stayed there till I think August. I was there from June to August. And I was on my own a lot of the day. I I volunteered in a little daycare center. I'm not sure how that worked with language, but there I was helping out with the little children, and I walked around the city. It was very exotic to me. I had lived in Europe also, but Europe had been less exotic in the sense of the little carts with lottery tickets and the goats roasting in the windows of restaurants and on spits, and the life of the pampas. It was exciting to me and very colorful, and at the same time there was very high cultural offerings. I was very interested in classical music, and we went to hear concerts a lot in Buenos Aires.
We still have those things, the chicken and the theaters and the concerts. As a product of that experience, you wrote a short story that you actually rewrote many times. Could you tell us a little bit about that story? Or because it is at one of your essays, it's the topic of one of your essays.
Oh, well, that several stories, I'd say 4 or 5 stories came out of that experience. And the one was really a more traditional short story that I wrote when I was about 19, shortly after that visit. And it was sort of a Hemingway-esque story about living in a place where people spoke Spanish, how he quotes Spanish in his stories in English. Mm-hmm. And some of the exotic came into it, and some of there were concerts in it. The main character was an old man, which of course wasn't modeled on me very much, but he was a concert goer and so on. So that was a very traditional story. But then there was another that I made up, that I put together from my mother's notes about living in an apartment with a cook and a maid. Now, this was not the way we normally lived at home. We did not have a cook or a maid, but they were included with the rent of this apartment. So, well, actually, that's another short story that I wrote based on the 2 women, not using my mother's notes. And then many years later, another one using my mother's notes, and then another one just using a very small incident with involving a vacuum cleaner. So I actually, Buenos Aires inspired, I hadn't realized it till this moment, that inspired stories about 4 different stages of my writing. So the more conventional, still somewhat conventional, but moving away from Hemingway, and then very short and experimental and so on. It did not be a source of inspiration.
Interesting that Buenos Aires caused all this experimenting. And you mentioned the word conventional, and I think you are a very unconventional writer. In one of your essays, you talk about the pressure of the editors to fit the market. So how did you manage that, being such an unconventional writer?
Oh, say it again, that I did what?
The pressure of editors for the writer to fit the market, right? You advise young writers against that, about that, resist that pressure. So how did you do it? How did you do it?
I think I did it by, and this is another piece of advice I always give young writers, is not to try to enter the commercial world and try to make money and try to make a success. Don't have that on the top of your mind. And it wasn't on the top of my mind. I was very much an idealist and a purist. And so the way I avoided it was I always wrote for a different sort of audience. If I wrote for any audience, it was my fellow writers who were also writing unconventional poetry and prose, and also not trying, you know, I think probably I always thought it would be nice to be published by a large publisher, but in the beginning I didn't worry about it. I published with very small publishers who liked what I did. So it was a matter of going to people who liked what I was already doing, rather than trying to change to fit someone else's ideas.
Besides, you come from a family of writers, right? So maybe that helped shape your idea of an audience, right? What's your first memory about writing? What's the first thing you wrote in your life? Do you remember?
Well, those are like two different questions, because I know what some of the first things were that I wrote, but I don't know if I remember writing them. You know how when your mother tells you something or you see something, you get mixed up as to whether you remember it or you're only hearing it now. So I actually have a piece of writing from when I was about 7 years old. And I have another, and I have my diary, which I started when I was 12. And I guess the diary would be the start of writing more seriously, having ambitions to write and trying to write really well. So I do have fairly early memories of showing my mother's stories. And as you say, she was a writer, my father was too. So they were very ready to critique and comment on what I wrote. So I can remember showing her short stories, some of which were about her or were modeled on our relationship. Wow. And she had the difficult task of trying to accept that and at the same time comment on the story as a piece of writing.
How was it, the comment? Was it encouraging for you, or?
Yeah, they were usually encouraging. I did get a lot of encouragement, but she did always emphasize that I should try to see both points of view and not just write from my.
Interesting.
She was right.
Right. What about reading? What's your first memory? I don't mean the first book you read, but the first book that maybe you read and thought, I want to be a part of this. I want to belong to this world.
Yeah, those are two different things. I was a great reader when I was little, and nothing gave me more pleasure really than to sink into a story and get completely lost in it. And I mean novels, you know, age 11, 12. But the first one that I appreciated as a piece of more grown-up writing, as writing per se, was a novel by John Dos Passos.
Wow.
And I can't remember now. I've gone back and looked to try to see which novel it was. And I can't pin it down, but I remember reading it on the public bus on my way to school. That's how I went to school, as I took 2 public buses. And I did a lot of reading on the bus, and I can remember just relishing the writing in itself. It was no longer just a matter of the story and the imaginative situation, but the writing. So, and that must have been around the same age, 12 or 13.
He's such a complex writer, right? I mean, he works with this juxtaposition of images, you know, almost like a film, but in writing. So, wow, I understand why you liked it, but also you were very young to be reading John Dos Passos, right? And you mentioned the notes from your mother that were the origin of that short story. And in your essays, you are very generous and you show us a lot about your process. But you also said, well, you take your ideas from notes, letters of complaint, letters from other writers' dreams. And there is a passage where you say that you don't really change the material so much that sometimes you just reorganize it. Is that true? Because when we read it, it is so polished, so perfect, that I find it hard to believe that you don't do anything besides organizing it.
Well, you're right. But it's not rewriting what I start with so much as cutting and pasting, say. A lot of cutting, sometimes changing the order a little bit, but not actually rewriting within the material. So that was my mother's notes. I quote, but I don't use every bit of every one, and I put my own section titles on them and then rearrange it. And that was true of another called Lord Royston's Tour, about I guess early 19th century lord traveling, going on his a trip after university and writing home about it. So there again, I just used sections of the letters and sometimes just very little from each letter and put my own titles on the sections. Sometimes change a word or two there. So I didn't have a strict rule that I couldn't change anything, but what excited me about the material was the way it was written, usually. Yeah. So I didn't want to change
there
it.
There was something there already that you wanted to keep.
Yes.
Interesting. One thing I love about your writing is the way you work with silence. Silence is another material for you. And there is a beautiful phrase, and I read it in translation, so I'm not sure I'm correct in the quoting, but it says, "In silence, pain is alive." You wrote that, or something close to that. But could you elaborate on that? Because I think it's related to your idea of the fragment and the ruin. It's a very complex idea, so I would love for you to explain it for the audience.
So the quote was, "In silence, pain is
alive."
That's so interesting because you're translating it right now back into English from
right. I'm doing.
What is it? Do you remember what it was in Spanish?
Yes, maybe I can find it. En el silencio el dolor está vivo. It's almost the same. I don't know how you wrote it in English. It's the problem with translation, right? We can talk about that a lot.
And which essay is it from?
It's the one you talk about, the fragment and the ruin, about bards and different writers and the way they work with a fragment. So I think there is well, the way I interpreted it is that silence is related to those forms, to the fragment and the ruin. But there are different kind of silences there. So that would be a more easy way to put the question.
I think the reason it's not a vivid memory is that I wrote that, which was started as a talk that I gave. I wrote it quite a long time ago in the 80s. So I haven't revisited it. I revisited it for the book to read it through, and but that was a very complexly structured talk and essay, taking from different authors and actually itself incorporating a lot of silences, a lot of breaks. I do feel strongly that the fragment is a very eloquent form. And as I explain a little bit, for a couple of reasons. One is that it takes you back a little closer to the writer actually composing what's written. In other words, if you read something which is the opposite, very fluid, very full, very, no hesitations, no breaks, that's been worked on a great deal. That's not how we think and talk and how things begin. So it's gone through many, many versions, and it's very polished and in a way self-conscious. And the fragment gives the illusion, anyway, of something that is just being born, that's just coming into being. And I don't know about the silence being pain, but I mean, except in the sense of when we are in too much pain to talk, in fact, when we are very emotional, we are usually not very fluent. We are usually very halting, repetitious, breaking off our sentences. And there is a lot of pain potentially in those hesitations and those silences. Or when you're just too emotional to say anything at all, which also happens.
Right. Yeah, I think another piece of advice you give is against dialogue that is emotionally loaded, right? Because of that. You know, Borges once said that we as readers of fiction, we have the right to expect the unexpected from a short story. And you use a lot the word surprise, the idea that the writers you like are the writers that surprise you as a reader. So how do you create that surprise, or how do you create the unexpected as a writer, as a fiction writer? Are you conscious of that when you're working, or it's something that just happens?
Yeah, it's complicated because I wouldn't set out to surprise the reader. I wouldn't say, this is what I want to do, surprise the reader. I always start from something that surprises me, whether it's this found material we've been talking about, or my own idea, or my own sentence that starts a story. So I start with, I don't even write it unless I myself am surprised and, excuse me, usually delighted or pleased by some idea or some sentence. I say, oh, that's kind of neat, or that's nice. And I start in doing something with it. So the surprise is already there for me, or I wouldn't be interested. It has to be fresh, which is, to me, is the same as surprise. The only way that calculation would come in would be when I'm revising farther in the process. And then I might be likely to cut part of a sentence, or cut even a short sentence, because it's too predictable. For example, I can't reproduce exactly what it was in the actual story, but something like, I wonder why he said that to me. Oh, I know. He said it because... And I think I might cut out, oh, I know, and somehow go more quickly to, I know why he said it. You know, try to, so then it's on a very micro level. It's a matter of pacing, that I don't want the next sentence to be predictable. So then I would work on it that way. And I tend to do that with other people's writing too, published writing. I can say, whoops, they should have cut that sentence. Or they should have
Right. So you take your pencil when you're reading and you mark your book.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah, we can tell you work a lot with the phrase, I mean, the syntax, the montage between paragraph, and we are, as readers, are, you know, thankful for that. Let's talk about humor. Humor is perhaps the most difficult effect in the text, right? But you have a lot of humor. I mean, you work with the absurd, for example. That is also something that comes to you naturally, or?
Yeah, again, and I guess I would tell students this too. You can't manufacture it. You know, if you don't have a sense of humor, it's very hard to be funny in a piece of writing. I suppose it doesn't hurt to try, but usually, and I think a lot about this from time to time about friends, you know, this one has no sense of humor. This one appreciates humor, but never is funny herself. And this one is funny quite often, you know, that sort of thing. And then I wonder if you get it from your parents. And you know, I don't know if that's true or not. Do you know do you have any friends who have a great sense of humor, but have parents who had no sense of humor? You know, I don't know. But, so it's a matter of, you know, so letting the humor come out. I mean, I think in the beginning, I wasn't even very aware of my sense of humor. I was writing from a persona, not mine, but an assumed persona that was very straight and earnest, but she had a strange outlook on the world and she had strange ideas. And what I remember is that the first time I gave a public reading, people started laughing. And I hadn't up to then realized quite how funny the stories were. And of course, not all the stories are funny, but it does come out a lot just because of me, you know, just from me.
Right, but you are also a reader of writers that have a great sense of humor. When you write about Flaubert, for example, your essay is almost like a critical masterpiece on irony, right? How he works with irony and how you show us in each line all the different levels of that irony working. And then you wrote 2 essays about 2 very well-read writers in Argentina. One is Lucia Berlin, and the other is Shem Bowles. Humor is a great element in the writing. Can you maybe comment on what are the things you like most about both of them?
Yeah, it's very interesting, really, because when you mention Flaubert, there's a lot of humor in him, and there's also a lot of humor in Proust. And yet, when we talk about both of them, that's not what we emphasize. We talk about, Emma Bovary's tragic suicide, or we talk about Proust's, long disquisitions about memory. But we don't say how funny they are. They really are very funny. Yeah. I've just been reading Lucia Berlin's some letters that in a volume that may be published next year. Her letters back and forth with Kenward Elmsley, a poet and librettist, and she also wrote letters to me, but also throughout her stories, of course, the humor. And again, she's writing about often the grim topics, as you know, alcoholism and being a single mother and single alcoholic mother and trying to work at very difficult and uninspiring jobs and so on. But she finds humor in at every turn, really, and can laugh at herself. And I've known people like that who described to me a devastating experience, but now that it's passed, can see the humor of this or that moment. Jane Bowles is very different kind of humor because she's so stylized. Her writing is not natural and conversational the way Lucia Berlin's is. It's very poised, stylized, almost made of wax, and hilariously funny because of her in a very different way, because she's taking on this deadpan voice that pretends not to know how funny it is. Whereas Lucia Berlin knows she's being funny. She's like a friend who's telling you a story and laughing and crying. So it's very different. And I do think it's very interesting to analyze things like how the humor is working. Just I've done this with, say, the English writer Barbara Kim. I don't know if she's read very much in Argentina.
I don't think so. No.
PYM.
Yeah, we depend on translations, you know, how it is.
Yeah. So, you know, I enjoy just but you could do this with Jane Bowles or Lucia Berlin. And just start from the beginning and read it sentence by sentence and say, what is the first moment where humor comes in, you know?
And usually it's a juxtaposition of elements. I mean, you showed it very well in one of your essays. Another question I had is, you mentioned Clarice Lispector as an influence or a writer that you liked. And that is a writer that is really well read in Argentina. So I would like you to comment about the things you like about her.
Oh, just nothing that would surprise you. It's she's very different, of course, but her wild imagination and sense that anything could happen at any time in the stories. So there's a feeling of liberation and sort of fierce energy.
Yes, she's a very free writer. I have always that impression while reading at her, that she does whatever she wants and she gets away with it, right?
Yeah.
You seem to distract creative writing workshops. I mean, throughout your essays, I noticed that you don't advise for new or young writers to take a lot of writing workshops, but you are a writer in residence at SUNY Albany, right?
Well,
so do you teach creative writing? That will be the question. Do you teach it? How do you teach it?
I retired about 5 years ago, but for a lot of my life, I did teach creative writing out of financial necessity. And also, but not only that, also because I didn't think I could do them any harm. I don't believe in writing workshops myself for many reasons, but I didn't think I would hurt them. One way a teacher can hurt you is by stamping out your individuality, saying, no, that's really doesn't work. You can't do that, you know. Whereas I would prefer to see students try anything they wanted to try and work from their own desires and then try to make it work, you know, as a piece of writing. I would want to help them make it work rather than say you can't do that. So I didn't think I would do them any harm. And, you know, there are good aspects of it, but I think the danger is that, I mean, as a writer, you're everyone's very vulnerable. So you bring in something that you care about and you read it aloud to the class, and a lot of students are terrified of that. They tremble and they, you know, and then your classmates, they either look bored or they're doing something else, or they say, well, I didn't really get it. You know, they throw cold water on it. Sometimes they love it, but, you know, that's dangerous too, because, you know, who knows why they love it. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is you're submitting your new tentative efforts to a public opinion much too early. And the public opinion is going to have an effect on you. And, you know, I think either way, even if they love it, it's not a good effect necessarily. So actually, I had one student who admitted to me that she was already doing what I advised, which was the things she cared most about, she didn't show anybody. She didn't show the class. But what she did show the class were sort of working stories that she thought would teach her something. Let's see if I can write a story about blah, blah, blah. You know,
exercises.
Yeah, sort of like a challenge to herself, but it wasn't something she cared so deeply about that she was going to be upset. So I thought it was a great idea.
Protecting herself from the audience.
Yeah,
that is always a good idea. I agree. it's difficult to take criticism, especially at an early stage.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
Speaking about public opinion and about criticism, do you care? Do you care about the reviews, the critics?
I guess, I don't know. It would depend who wrote it and what they said. It would even more depend on if they were touching upon something I was secretly worried about. Do I do this too much, or do I, is this a problem in my work? And then they go boing, they hit it, and that would probably make me discouraged. But I'm trying to think, I don't read them carefully all the time. Sometimes I have my husband read them first, and so he can say, well, it's a positive. But I'm very, very happy when people I care about like something. So that's in a way all that matters. If there are a few intelligent writer friends really like something, that's what I care about the most.
Related to this, you wrote about censorship, like internal censorship, how sometimes a writer would cut something or second guess herself about what she's doing. So as a woman writer, do you think you had to deal with a specific ways of censorship?
You're asking if I've had to deal with my own censorship?
And of course, external censorship too, in the form of opportunities or in the form of, I don't know, pressures from editors on themes or topics you were supposed to address.
Not really. I mean, I've already done my own censorship in the most basic way of things I feel one shouldn't write about or shouldn't say or shouldn't publish. I have private notebooks, and I feel I can say whatever I want in my private notebooks, but then there's a dividing line. I don't think certain things should be said by anyone, or certain, especially now. I mean, most of my life I didn't live in the times we live in now.
Right. Now it's even more difficult.
Yes, in the US, I mean, it wasn't like this. We've gone in and out of very bad periods. I was just talking about an older couple that I know here in the village who lived through the times of Joseph McCarthy in the early 50s, when there was raging anti-communism in the US. And that was very, very hard for people, especially writers. But the years of Trump, which may come back again to, we live in a very dangerous time, they changed the US profoundly. So particularly in these times, I would lean over backwards not to say negative, partisan, hateful things,
Yeah, it happens to all of us. It's not only in the US, the idea of the politically correct censorship operating in the very moment you are writing something, right? It's difficult to deal with that.
Well, there's such a thing as sincere political correctness and insincere political. But I think in the most sincere level, you don't want to speak negatively about groups of people. And that's something, again, Trump and his friends branded as a mere show. Political correctness is a mere show. Well, it isn't a show when it comes from a deeper place. So.
No, of course. Speaking of Trump and the US, how do you see the current situation of the humanities in the academic system? Because I know there's a big crisis.
Yeah, the crisis started happening before him, and happening, I guess, in the UK too, and probably everywhere. I don't know, but
Europe, yeah.
But the change in attitude, so that kids should not a study in university something that isn't going to pay, that isn't going to lead to a good job. And the devaluation of the humanities, that, you know, university isn't a time for expanding your mind and learning new ideas and debating new philosophies. It's just training for work. Of course, in the US, the student loan situation has terribly distorted the studying of the humanities, because if you have a huge debt, which some students have, many students have, then you can't afford just to spend a year wandering around Europe the way my generation used to do, and then find yourself and see if you wanted to be a guitar teacher or, you know, something. You have to think practically, and so students who might have wanted to study philosophy might get a degree in business now, and it's just very, very, very bad. And I think doing away with the student loan debt is, you know, just one move like that could change everything. You know?
Yeah, in Argentina we have a public education system at the university, and one of the best things of our country. But these are very demanding times for the young students, right? I mean, they are asked to do a lot, and that creates a lot of anxiety. And, you know, anxiety is the topic of our festival. So
it is.
Yes. I mean, as a last question, because you have been very generous with your time, how do you deal with anxiety as a writer, and especially last year during the pandemic? Was it hard for you? How did you experience that situation?
I was just thinking about anxiety today. Maybe underneath I remembered that was the theme of the festival, but
something you're unconscious.
Because I think I operate always at a slight level of anxiety, at least slight. And I think that's because there's so many things I want to do and intend to do and have on my sort of list of things to do. So even if I'm doing one, I'm feeling a little uneasy about the other one that I'm not doing. And so you asked several questions. I'll answer all of them, try to answer several. So the way I deal with it, I suppose, when I'm being sensible, when I'm not just being anxious, is to prioritize, to say, okay, you can't do them all at once, and this is the one you're going to do now, and you're going to feel good that you've done it, and then you're going to do that one and feel good that you've done it, and try to handle it that way. And that works pretty well. And you asked how I dealt with the pandemic. I was talking to good friends. I went through a ridiculous thing over the weekend or before the weekend, trying to get tested so that I could see a group of friends. And the at-home test came back positive, but I didn't quite believe it. So I went and got a better test and it was negative. But all this took a lot of time. But one of my friends, when I finally did see them, he said he was getting through the pandemic in two ways, I guess socially, or I don't know, socially. One was we all see each other every Friday night for an hour or so, remotely. And that has been really, really nice. We see more of each other this way than we ever did in person. And we all enjoy it. There's always something different to talk about. It's great. And the other way was visits from his family. So I went home thinking about that and realizing that I have both of those things, but I'm working with my village. I'm on my village governing board. So we have monthly meetings and we have, again, remotely. And we have issues to discuss, proposals to make. And then I'm also on a smaller committee dealing with the climate. So we have now weekly meetings and again, little jobs to do and little things to research. And I was realizing, I did these things because I wanted to do them, but that it's also been a form of company and a form of engagement and not, so I'm not feeling isolated. And then I have a garden that I'm very ambitious about also, a large, I'm developing a permaculture garden. I don't know if you call it the same thing in Spanish.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And so that means planting fruit trees and taking care of everything going out there.
Wow.
So all these things, I think engagement with other people is very, very important. And then having projects.
Thank you. Thank you. We hope we will have more books from you translated into Spanish. So far, Eterna Cadencia translated the first volume of the essays. I understand you have a second one about translation, right?
I do, yeah.
Hopefully we'll have that soon in Spanish too.
That will be in English next month.
Okay, so we'll be on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.